Good morning, everyone. We'll be substituting this recording for our in-class lecture, which means I have my coffee with me, and you can too. We're going to be skipping to evolution for this. We're going to be finishing the chemistry unit in class because that's harder for me to do remotely. So you'll be responsible for the material in this PowerPoint as if I had given this lecture in class. You're also responsible for whatever is embedded in it, so videos and things like that. Where those appear, I will just refer to them. You can pause the recording or you can exit the slideshow and you can go check that material out and then come back at your convenience and hear the rest of this lecture. So we're going to start with the story of Charles Darwin and how he developed his theory of natural selection as an explanation for how evolution works. So evolution and natural selection are not exactly the same. Natural selection is part of evolution, but evolution is a larger concept. So right now, we're focusing on natural selection. So Charles Darwin, he was a pastor's son, didn't know what he wanted to do with his life. His father wanted him to become a pastor. That's what he thought he would do. And then he got invited to go on this long boat ride around the whole world on a ship called the Beagle. And he was just invited, really, to be company for the captain. And the captain was a pretty religious guy, and he wanted the company of an educated religious man to talk to him about the Bible and moral issues and things like that. And Darwin was also interested in the natural world, so his plan was to record his observations, collect specimens, as you can see in the jars on the left-hand side of the screen. And so that was his gig, to be company, to sit with the captain and have supper with him, and to make his recordings about the natural world. He had no other plan than that. So I've got a link here to the story of the voyage of the Beagle that was put together by the British Natural History Museum. Go through that when you have a chance. It just kind of tracks the travels of the ship around the globe and all the different places that they stopped and the things that Darwin saw. And at that point, in 1831, when he started on this trip on the Beagle, he didn't have any big plans to develop a theory that would change the world. He was just going along for the ride, and it wasn't always pleasant because he was very, very seasick. So check out what he did. And some of that before Darwin comes up with this big theory of natural selection, long after he gets back from his trip on the Beagle, there was kind of a way that people understood the world and the way they thought the world was structured. And this goes back to the ancient Greeks. So they thought that there was kind of this big ladder, and what they called the chain of being. And they thought there were things that were kind of low down on the order, that were insignificant, or not all that sophisticated or important. And those went from things that were not alive all the way up to the most important living things. So they put God at the top of this chain, and they put things like rocks down on the bottom. So you can see minerals is down near the bottom. And then slightly above minerals is plants. So plants are a little bit more important. They're a little bit more real. They have more of a being to them than rocks do. And then from there you see some kind of interesting stuff. Animals are above plants. Woman, slightly above animals. The whole thing is kind of odd because all humans are animals. But hey, women making it in there just above the animals. And then above woman is man. So man is more kind of highly evolved, more complete than woman. And then you get above man and the demons beat man out. And then the angels are better than the demons. And then God is the ruler of all and is more sophisticated and more fully realized and is the best. So it's kind of this ladder from the worst, the lowliest, the kind of the bottom dwellers up to more and more fabulous things all the way to God. And that's how they understood the world. Now, there were other people that started to look at this idea and wonder about it, even very early on. But if we look at, the major changes in scientific understanding, we're going to be looking at around 1800, the late 1700s, So we got this big-headed guy named Baron Cuvier, and his feeling on things, so he was interested in studying fossils. He was very rich, go out, dig things up. He even had a collection of fossilized poop, so he was interested in anything from ancient times. And he actually believed that things could go extinct because, he would dig up something like this picture on the right of the extinct Irish elk. So this is a creature that doesn't exist anymore. It's extinct. Pick up its bones in Ireland and find it, and he was like, well, this is clearly a thing that's not around anymore. So he believed that creatures existed for a certain amount of time, and then for some reason they went extinct, and other creatures kind of replaced them. So he believed that extinction happened, but he didn't think that evolution happened. So he didn't think that creatures could change over time. He didn't think that the Irish elk looked slightly different 1,000 years before and then its form had slowly changed time. Cuvier did not believe in that. He thought things just were the way they were, probably the way God created them, and they existed for a certain amount of time, and then they all died out, and something new came along that God had created. So it was a pretty simplistic way of understanding named Lamarck. And he lived in the late 1700s, early 1800s, same as a lot of these other guys. And he did believe that species could change over time. So he didn't just believe things get created, they live a while, then they die. He thought, no, I think that, their forms could change and their forms could adapt to their circumstances. But he didn't quite get the way that it happened right. So his most famous example was this picture over here on the right of the giraffes. So he thought that you had something like a giraffe, and it's out on the African savanna, and it's trying to eat leaves that are on a tall tree. And we know from the fossil record that there were creatures that looked kind of like giraffes. They had shorter necks. So he thought, okay, well, what if you start out with giraffes that have shorter necks, and they eat all the leaves they can reach, and then once they've eaten all those leaves, they want to get to the leaves that are higher up. So what they do is they stretch their necks. They just reach, trying to get those tall leaves. And they stretch so hard that over their own lifetimes, their necks actually extend. And then the most important thing there was that he believed that once their necks had stretched from all that reaching over the course of their lifetimes, that change would get passed down to their babies. And their babies would be born with longer necks. And then their babies could stretch their own necks and go on from there. So he did notice and he did believe that animals could adapt to their surroundings. You could end up with giraffes that had longer necks if they were living in a place where the leaves were way up high. He just thought it could happen to an individual giraffe, that a giraffe could stretch its neck physically to be able to reach those leaves, and then its babies would have longer necks. We know that now that's not the way it happens, although surprisingly in recent times it has turned out that there are certain changes that can happen to your DNA during your own lifetime that you could hand down to your offspring. But most things are not like that. Things that happen to you during your lifetime that you weren't born with, if you get your finger chopped off in a lawnmower accident, your offspring are not born with a missing finger because you lost one in your lifetime. You can only pass down what's in your DNA when you're born. There are variations on that, but Lamarck was not quite right on how this worked. But he did at least accept that species could change over time. Within a species, you could go from short-necked giraffes to, over a long, long time, you could have longer-necked giraffes. But he thought an individual outside of people looking at living things, we also had people working in other fields of science that were also starting to question what was going on. So we have this man named James Hutton. He's another Englishman. Lots of old white dudes here, because that's where the stuff was going on at the time. And he lived slightly earlier, so 1700s, and he was interested in studying rocks. So he would travel around the countryside and dig up rocks and try to figure out what sorts of rocks they were. And he noticed things like in this right side picture, you can see that the rocks are in layers. It almost looks like a layer cake. Layers stacked upon layers upon layers upon layers. And when he took those up and studied them and looked at what they were made out of, he realized that a lot of these rocks were made of layers and layers and layers of sand, where something like a river must have been running and kind of dropping sand to the riverbank, into the riverbed. And over time, that sand that was getting deposited in layers on the bottom of the river would turn to stone. And his idea was that in order to get a layer of rock that thick, with layer and layer and layer and layer upon layer of rock within it, had to have happened over a long, long time. And at the point when he was living, there were still a lot of people that said, the Earth is only a few thousand years old, it hasn't been around that long, everything that we see living on the Earth just kind of got dropped off here all at once by God or some creator. And he started to challenge that. He's like, no, I don't think that these layers of rock could have been slowly deposited over time and have it gotten done in 6,000 years. He's like, I think we're talking more like millions of years. And he was still way off, because the Earth is actually billions of years old. But he was on the right track. He's looking around and saying, there has not been time for all these things to happen if the Earth is only 6,000 years old. So this idea that the Earth may be much, much older than that opens up a whole range of possibilities for biologists who had been struggling with the idea that species could change and evolve over time, but how could it possibly happen within only a few thousand years? So Hutton comes along and says, no, 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 I think this Earth is much, much older than that. And if the Earth is millions of years old, he's saying, there's been time for these creatures to evolve and change very slowly over the course of the Earth's history. So this opens things up for other scientists. Now we get back to some of the things that Darwin actually observed himself and other people were starting to see. It was just a matter of who was going to put it together first. So one of the places that Darwin went along his world travels, as you saw if you went through that British Museum virtual tour, which I recommend you do, he was just kind of taking notes on the creatures that he saw. So when he gets to South America, he notices this curious thing where on this slide, at the top of the slide, you see pictures of what's called the Patagonian cavy on the left, on the upper left. And then on the upper right, you've got the South American guinea pig. And the guinea pig in that picture is a wild guinea pig. It lives in the forests of South America, dense brush, kind of scurries around under the trees and in the bushes. And it eats plant material. And Darwin saw these things, and he observed them, and he wrote about them in his notebooks. And what seemed strange was that if you look at the faces of the two, so the South American guinea pig, even in the wild, looks pretty much like a guinea pig at the pet store or in a cage at your house. They're pretty much the same creature. But over on the left, we got the Patagonian cavy, and you can see it's a much bigger bodied creature, much longer legs. Guinea pigs have these little stubby legs, very cute, a very rounded body with a big butt. The Patagonian cavy is much leggier, really long legs, a longer neck. The guinea pig looks like it has no neck at all, and much longer ears. And yet there's something about its face that's very similar to the South American guinea pig. So that's curious. You know, they look like they're related to each other, except their bodies are so differently formed. And then, so you've got an example like that, where you've got creatures that both live in South America. Their faces look pretty similar. Their head shapes look similar. They look like they could be related, but their bodies are formed very differently. Patagonian cavy lives on open grasslands, not a lot of trees around, just, races around, eats grass, needs to be able to see predators coming and get away quickly. And the guinea pig, like I said, scurries around in the underbrush, in the thick growth in the forest. So their faces look similar. They're living in very different places within the continent of South America, so their environments are different. And then when Darwin was in Australia, he sees all these marsupials. So these are the mammals with pouches that carry their young in pouches. So he sees kangaroos out on the open grasslands, right? And they have long, powerful legs, and they hop, and they've got this long tail, and they've got a long face and big ears. And then he remembers that back in England and back in Europe, when you go to the open grasslands, you see European hares. So these down here on the right, these are two hares fighting for territory, mate or something. And you look at their bodies, they have these big, long feet, big, long legs, tall ears, a long face with eyes set on either side of the face. And so physically, they actually look quite similar to each other. Now, kangaroos in Australia, they're marsupials. They live way down in Australia. They shouldn't really have much in common in terms of how related they are with hares living way up in Europe. So the key comes in, what is the deal with the environment of these creatures? So you've got two kind of different issues here. You've got two creatures, the kangaroo and the European hare, that live very, very far apart, and yet their bodies resemble each other very closely. And then on the top two, you've got the Patagonian cavy and the South American guinea pig, and superficially, like, their faces suggest that they may be close relations, but their body types are so different. So if we look at a map of what we call the biomes across the Earth. So biomes are types of environments. We see that there are certain biomes that recur at different places around the world, even when they're very far apart. So if you look at rainforest, for instance, that's the darkest green. You can see the upper part of South America has a lot of rainforest. So does a band across the middle of Africa. And then over in Southeast Asia, a lot of the islands there are all rainforest. So you think of it as a jungle habitat, right? Now, that dark green jungle in South America is the kind of habitat that a guinea pig is adapted to. Lots of trees, lots of brush, has to scurry around in the underbrush and try to find food. If you look at where the Patagonian cavy lives, you have to go down to the southern part of South America, and you see that orange area. So that's grassland, savanna, shrubland. So this is places where there's either no trees or very few trees, and just grass as far as the eye can see. So we have that kind of habitat down there in Patagonia in southern South America. If you look up where we are in North America, the Midwest, where the prairies are, that's all grassland too. So even though those are a continent apart, if you went and visited them, the environment would look very similar. And then if you go to parts of Eastern Europe and across the middle of Russia and places like that, you get grassland up there too. And sure enough, in Australia, you get an area in the eastern part of Australia where you have grassland as well. No trees, just grass. And so if you look at the creatures that live in similar habitats across the globe, even if they are continents away from each other, you will find that that environment has driven those creatures to take on a similar appearance. So if you are a creature that eats grass and runs around in a savanna or a grassland where there are no trees, it's going to be helpful to you to have big, long legs, powerful feet. You can run or you can cross that open grassland so you can get away from predators. You can move quickly. And you don't have to worry about getting stuck in the trees. So rabbits, hares with big, long legs, powerful feet, good jumpers, good runners, and kangaroos, way over in Australia, kind of look similar because their environments are so similar. So those environments have driven those adaptations in those creatures and caused them to look similar to each other. If we look at the guinea pig and the cavy, on the other hand, they both live in South America, but one lives up in that green jungle area and one lives down in the orange grassland area. So they are actually pretty closely related in terms of their DNA. They came from an ancestor that they shared not too long ago, and that's why their faces look so similar. But their bodies look so different because their environments have shaped them differently. A guinea pig can have short, stubby legs and a big butt, and pretty much no neck, because it needs to be like this little moving bullet that needs to kind of push its way through the undergrowth and the trees. Doesn't live on a grassland, doesn't need to make these big sprints across the savanna to get away from a predator. If a predator comes, it just crawls into the shrubs and it hides. A cavy, even though it's related to the guinea pig pretty closely in terms of DNA, is under completely different circumstances, completely different pressures. So it's that environmental pressure that dictates what you're going to look like and how your body's going to be formed. Now, this was the idea that Darwin was kind of going to warm up to, but at the time that he made his voyage around the world, he hadn't had this idea yet. Nobody had. Everybody was just kind of recording things and digging up fossils. So one example of this is Darwin gets to the Galapagos Islands. So these are a cluster of islands off the coast of western South America, so off the coast of Ecuador, pretty far out in the ocean, not that close to shore. And when the Beagle gets there and Darwin gets off and starts describing things and writing things down, one of his is just to collect specimens. So he doesn't know every creature on Earth. He's just kind of drawing pictures of them and writing notes about them and shooting them and putting them in jars and putting them in boxes and putting them on the boat to take back to England to show them to scientists who know what they're looking at. So when they get to the Galapagos, Darwin sees all kinds of really cool stuff. And then he sees, some kind of drab brownish birds. Some have big beaks and some have small beaks. Some have pointy beaks and some have stubby beaks. And he just figures they're all just a bunch of different kinds of birds, like sparrows or, whatever they are. He's not that interested in them. But he collects them because that's part of his job, and he puts them in boxes. And then he gets back to doing what he wants to do, which is like riding the giant tortoises that live on the Galapagos. Or he was very entertained by the fact that there were these iguanas called marine iguanas that would walk right up to a person, and you could take the iguana and throw it out into the ocean, and it would swim back, which is a pretty clever trick, and it would walk right up to you again, so you could pick it up and toss it. It was like playing fetch with itself. So there was a lot of fun stuff to do on the Galapagos. Darwin was not all that interested in these birds. He didn't even know they were finches. He just thought that they were all kinds of different birds, and so he put them in boxes and shipped them and got back to riding tortoises. Once these creatures got shipped back to England and scientists at the museums were able to look at them and figure out what they were pretty intrigued because they had samples from mainland South America, and then now they had samples from the Galapagos, and they could look at, say, these birds that Darwin had sent back, and they gave him this report where they said, it's funny, all the birds you sent us from the Galapagos were finches. And Darwin's like, are you sure? I mean, they look like all different kinds of birds to me. Like, I don't know much about that, but they certainly looked different. Like, no, they're all finches, and they actually bear a lot of similarity to a particular species of finch that lives back on the mainland. And they're like, but, it's weird because some of them look pretty similar to that mainland finch, but then others have look very, very different, much, much bigger beaks or much pointier beaks. And you've sent back a lot of different species of finch, And they're weird. We've never seen this kind of cluster of finches before, but we do have this one finch that lives back on the mainland that looks pretty similar, that we think is closely related. So the fact that the Galapagos animals are this strange mix of things that are seen nowhere else on Earth, but also have these unusual similarities to things back on the mainland that we already did know about. This is where it all starts to come together after the fact. He's looking back at all of his notes, he's thinking about these things, and he's starting to get this inkling of an idea. And he starts to organize it over time, and he does a lot of writing on it, but he doesn't really tell anybody about it because he knows that this is going to be a controversial thing. The idea that species change over time, one species can evolve from another species, all of this is going to change the way the whole world works. And he's nervous about that. He's this, shy pastor's son, doesn't want to rock the boat, literally, because he gets seasick. So he was not thrilled with sharing this news. But here's how it all came down. So these finches are part of the key to this whole thing. So they're all finches. They're all closely related to each other. If you were able to test their DNA, which at that time, nobody could understand that. Nobody even knew really what DNA was. So that was an option. But just based on comparing characteristics of their bodies and different features like that, the scientists were able to say these are all finches and they're all pretty closely related. So Darwin starts to organize them. He says, okay, well, we've got a few different kinds of groups of finches here. So in this kind of rainbow-shaped arc of finches, over on the right side, you've got the pink band that says ground finches. So these guys tend to hop around and grab seeds from the ground. Over on the left side, you've got a band of orangish that says tree finch. So these guys feed up in the trees rather than on the ground. And then in the middle, we've got this one thing that's called the warbler finch. And it actually looks quite different. It has this like needle-like beak. And it actually catches insects kind of all over the place. So those are the three main categories of finches. And then within that, we've got this white band underneath that says the different kinds of beaks. So over on the right, we've got the crushing beaks. So these are big, chunky beaks that can smash things. And then in the middle range, we've got probing beaks. So these are long and pointy. And probing means you kind of stick your beak into something, like a hole in a tree, and you dig around for some insects or something. And then over on the left, we've got what they're classifying as grasping beaks or parrot beaks. So these are things that can grab onto a stick-like thing or something like that in order to get food. And then in terms of what they eat, he also classified them that way. So over here, the ground finches with the crushing beaks, they eat seeds. And that makes sense. If you're going to eat a seed, you have to have some way to open the seed. So these big crushing beaks are associated with finches that eat seeds. And then if you come over here, you've got this green band that says insect eaters. And if you notice, the beaks on the insect eaters tend to be longer, more slender, and they often have almost a little tiny hook on the end that would help them kind of pinch onto an insect, grab it, and eat it. So it seems clear, based on looking at what the finches look like, and by observing them in the wild to see what they eat, that they're a pretty close match between the kind of beak you have and the food that you eat. Now, for a long time, people just assumed that that was because, you just ate what you could with the beak that you had. But what Darwin starts to say is that, no, maybe what's happening here, so I've got this scientist telling me that all of these finches are pretty closely related, and they all look fairly similar to this one finch on the mainland. So what if, at one point in time, long ago, a few finches from the mainland got blown out to sea during a storm or something like that, and they ended up in the Galapagos, and they started up their own little colony. There were enough of them, they start laying eggs, they start reproducing, and up to that point, there were no birds on the Galapagos. So there's all these seeds and insects and things growing. There's lots of stuff to eat that nobody else is really taking advantage of. So from there, these finches start to spread and grow their population and spread across all the islands of the Galapagos. And certain finches end up specializing on eating seeds, and certain finches end up specializing on eating insects. And over time, as they continue to specialize on that one kind of food, their bodies start to reflect that. Because the better you are, if you're going to eat seeds, and you hatch out of the egg, and you happen to have a beak that's slightly better than your brothers and sisters at getting those seeds on the ground, you're going to be the one that survives, and you're going to be the one that gets to have offspring. And your offspring are going to tend to have a bigger beak like yours, rather than slightly smaller like your brothers and sisters did. So as you go through the generations, those seed-eating finches start to have beaks that are consistently getting larger and blockier for crushing seeds. Now, the finches that want to specialize on insects inside a cactus plant, a very different beak is going to serve that purpose. So a finch that happens to hatch out with a skinnier beak may run around and infer that that's good for grabbing insects. And if that skinny beak is slightly better than its neighbor with a slightly different shaped beak, then that skinny beak is going to be the winner. And that skinny-beaked finch is going to have skinny-beaked baby finches, and they're going to do better, and their offspring are going to be skinny-beaked too. So the idea here is that if you look at this rainbow-shaped graph, you look at kind of the central, the very middle of it down at the bottom where there's like a little black dot, and all the lines kind of radiate out from that. Darwin's idea was that all these different kinds of varieties of finches, different species of finches, actually came from one species of finch that originally made it to the Galapagos. And from there were so many different environments on the Galapagos that you end up getting a finch that is tailor-made, so is tailor-adapted to that particular niche, that particular way of making a living. So this is his idea of natural selection, that the environment dictates who the winners and losers are. And if a particular individual or particular individual organism, plant, fungus, bacterial cell, anything, is slightly better adapted to the environment that it is in, it will survive and it will get to reproduce. So this is the idea of natural selection. The environment dictates, and then whatever adaptations you have, if they're well suited for that environment, you survive. If your particular set of DNA is not so good for that environment, then you die, or you don't get to reproduce. So you're a loser in terms of natural selection. So Darwin has this idea, but he just sits on it for a while because it's kind of too big. And then in 1858, he gets a letter from a friend of his who also is interested in these topics, named Alfred Wallace. And Wallace basically writes him a letter that says exactly what Darwin has been thinking. He says, I think that species evolve from other species. He says, I think that the environment dictates it. I think that creatures are born with different sets of abilities, and if the environment dictates that that set of abilities is the best for that environment, then that one survives, and that one gets to survive, and that's why species change over time. It's because of the environment, and may the best adapted creature win. And Darwin is like freaking out. He kind of like poops himself, because he's like, oh my God, I worked so hard on this. I've worked to write this up and think about it and work all these things out, and now this guy's going to scoop me. He's going to tell the world, and it's going to look like it was he and not mine. And so Darwin has to really scramble. He writes up his results very quickly, and he actually ends up kind of jointly presenting with Alfred Wallace at very prestigious Linnean Society of London in 1858. So remember that Darwin took his boat ride on the Beagle in 1831 is when it started. It's not until 1858 that he's finally gotten to the point where he feels like he's understood what's going on out there and he's got his theory worked together and he's scrambled to write it up. And so he and Wallace present this to the Linnean Society, and from there on, everything about biology changes. So they've made, with this one paper, a massive shift in how we understand biology. So both their names are on it. It's kind of just one of these accidents of history that we don't say Wallace's theory of natural selection. Unfortunately for Wallace, nobody remembers him all that much. But Darwin's name gets attached to this. But the idea here is that it wasn't just Darwin. Other people were starting to look around at the science that existed and put it together. It was making sense based on the work other people were doing in geology and how old the Earth was and how species change and what extinctions have happened. And so Darwin has gotten pretty much all the credit. But the time was right for this idea to happen. Not that it went over well. A lot of people fought it pretty hard. But this was a big change in science at this point, 1858. So let's go into what Darwin actually said. So the basics in the theory. Individuals vary from one another, and the variation is heritable. So what Darwin said about this was any variation which is not inherited is not important to us. So this is like if you cut your finger off in a lawnmower. You are different from your neighbor who still has all 10 of his fingers. So you are a variation from your neighbor. But you don't then have babies that are all missing a finger. So that variation is not something that's inherited. It's not heritable. You can't pass it along to your offspring. So we don't care about it in terms of natural selection. Even if it gave you an advantage or a disadvantage in survival, you can't pass it on to the next generation. It does not count. So these are two things that are required. Individuals have to be different from each other. If everybody is exactly the same, if everybody's a clone of everybody else and everybody has the same DNA and the same body form and the same adaptations, then there's nothing for natural selection to work on. Natural selection has to have options to select from. It has to be able, the environment has to determine, okay, this one is better adapted and this one is less adapted. So this is the winner and this is the loser. So there must be differences in individuals, and those differences must be something that can be passed down in the DNA through the generations. Darwin didn't know about DNA, but he did know that things could be passed. So the other thing that natural selection requires, so individuals must be different from each other. It must be something they can pass down to the next generation. And there has to be what he called the struggle for existence. So, and we know this is basically true all the time. There is not unlimited resources. There's not unlimited food. There's not unlimited water. There's not unlimited shelter. Organisms are always going to be competing for those things. And that means that some of them are going to win the competition, and some are going to lose, and some are going to be kind of in the middle, sometimes winning, sometimes losing. So that's how natural selection determines the winners and losers, because there's a competition. You can't have winners and losers if nobody's competing for anything. So there has to be this competition. So you've got individuals that are different from each other. So they vary. There's variation. And you've got them struggling for limited resources. So not everybody is going to get everything they need. There are going to be some losers here. And what determines the ones that get to survive and reproduce and the ones that don't is not just random chance in natural selection. It is determined by who is better equipped for that particular environment. The environment is critical. What is a good adaptation for living under the water is not a good adaptation for living in the trees. So you must look at the environment all the time. So this whole idea put together, that there are variations in the population, that some of those variations are going to be helpful, some are not going to be helpful, and that's going to determine who lives and dies and who gets to reproduce, is what he calls natural selection. And we start to see it from there on. People begin to study this. So there have been scientists working and we see it on the Galapagos, looking at what they call Darwin's finches since the 1970s. They live there. They live, breathe, work, do everything on finches. And these are the same species of finches that Darwin observed back in the 1830s. So these scientists get to the islands in the 1970s, and they're interested in looking at exactly this. Why are there so many different kinds of finches on the Galapagos? Why have they taken on so many different shapes? And so they've been tracking. What they do on the Galapagos is they go out every breeding season and they grab hatchlings out of the nest of all these different species of finches, and they take measurements on them. So this picture here, overlaying the graph, this is one species of finch. Okay, so we've got two individuals from the same species of finch. These are ground finches. They eat seeds. And we'll talk about why they look still so different from each other, even though they're one species. But these researchers have been going out when those finches are breeding, and they collect the babies and they take measurements on them. They weigh them, they measure how deep their beaks are, they measure how long their beaks are. They get all this data on them. And then the other thing they're tracking is things about the environment. So what they find is if you look up on the top part of the graph, where you've got the red lines and the red dots, you'll see that there's a little word that says large at the top and a word that says small at the bottom. And you don't have to worry too much about the numbers on the left. That's just showing the variation. But what you want to focus on with the red line is that the higher the red line, the higher the dot, the larger the beak. And the lower the dot, the smaller the beak. So you can see that there's kind of peaks and valleys in that line. It's not a flat line. The beaks are not staying the same size. On the bottom of the graph, you see the years go by. So these people have been studying these finches for decades. They start in the 1970s, and they do this every year. They go out every time the finches are breeding, and they measure all the babies they can to see whether the beaks are bigger or smaller. And over time, they see that it changes. So some years they go out and they measure all the nestlings, and they find that most of them have really big beaks for that species. So those are the higher parts on the red lines. So there'll be many years where the beaks are really big. And then you'll see it start to drop off. And you'll see a period of time where the dots are much lower. That means the beaks are smaller. So for many years in a row, they'll test the babies, and they're like, okay, now the beaks seem to be smaller. And then they'll notice that, 20 years after that, the beak size is climbing again. So this kind of looks like it's random. It's like they drop, the beaks are smaller for a few years, and the beaks are larger for a few years, then they're smaller again. And it would seem random if you didn't remember the part about natural selection that says the environment is the critical driver in what adaptations are good and what adaptations are bad. And if you were to track the climate on the Galapagos over those same years, you would find that there are dry years and then there are wet years. And during the wet years, all the plants get all the water they need, and so they produce lots of seeds of all different shapes and sizes, and life is good for the finches, and everything is great. And then you'll get some years that just happen periodically where there's a drought, and a lot of the plants die, or plants just don't have the ability to produce seeds that year. And what tends to happen during dry years is that the only seeds that are available to the finches are big, tough seeds that can resist drying out completely. So that's mostly what's available to them. The plants that make the smaller seeds tend to struggle a lot more in the dry season. And so what you'll find is if you were to study that and say, okay, well, when are the dry years? You would see that there had been a drought from about 1978 to about 1982. Those were really dry years. And if you look at those years on the red line graph, you see that the beak sizes got really, really big during those years. So when they tested all these baby finches, they found that big beaks were becoming really common during those dry years. And that's because those big seeds are the only thing available to eat during those years. So it's not that there weren't babies hatching that had smaller beaks. It's just that as they got older and they started to try to feed on their own, they couldn't make it. They would try to crack those big seeds, and they didn't have the beak strength to do it. And there weren't any smaller seeds to live off of. So those babies didn't make it to adulthood, and they didn't get to reproduce. The individuals that happened, just by chance mutation in their DNA, to be born, to be hatched with bigger beaks, were in luck. During the dry season, all there is to eat is these big chunky seeds that take a big bulky beak to eat. And so those guys were the winners during those dry years. So that's why you see these big beaks for several years when it's dry. Then when the wet seasons come back, when the wet years come back and all the plants are able to thrive again and you get seeds of all different sizes, you see that the beak sizes come back down too, because it's no longer a huge advantage to have a big giant beak. It might even be somewhat of an advantage to have a medium-sized beak in those wetter years because you can eat both the bigger seeds, some of the bigger seeds, but then you can also get your beak into smaller crevices where there are seeds that the really big cousins of yours can't get to. But the critical thing here is these ups and downs make no sense unless we look at the actual environment that's driving them. So the bottom line, the blue line, is looking at beak shape. And it kind of follows along with beak size, so you tend to get really big-beaked, big short-beaked finches during the dry years, and then you get kind of smaller, thinner, pointier beaks in the wetter years. And so what you see here in the picture in the middle, it almost looks like those must be two different species of finch. And one's got a small beak and one's got a big beak. Or at least maybe you might say, well, maybe one's a female and one's a male, because sometimes males are bigger, sometimes females are bigger. And these are actually two of the same species of the same sex. It's just this is the variation within that species. These two birds are the same species. One has a big, chunky, honkin' beak over on the right, and the one on the left has a more delicate-looking beak. Same species, both survive to adulthood, both get to reproduce. They're actually a mated pair that are going to have offspring. Who knows what their offspring's beaks will look like. But as long as the environment favors both big beaks and smaller beaks, they will both win. They'll both live to be adults and have babies. During a dry year, that guy on the right is going to have a bigger advantage over the bird on the left because the bigger beaks are better for dry seasons when all there is available is these big chunky seeds. So there isn't one when we look at natural selection and then when we look at the bigger picture at evolution, we find that it's not all headed in one direction. So we have a tendency to think, okay, well, that big chunky beak, that can crush anything. So that must be the best. That must be the best adaptation you could possibly have. But if you were to get a season where those big chunky seeds weren't available and all that were available would be these little tiny seeds that you have to really get your beak into a little crevice to get to, now all of a sudden a big beak is not just neutral, it's bad. So what you're born with is just what you're born with. It's neither good, bad, or indifferent. It's what your environment is like that makes it a positive or a negative. So what we end up with in evolution is not a constant march toward the best species, where bigger beaks are better, and so they get bigger and bigger and bigger over time. It actually works like, it looks kind of random sometimes. You'll make 2 steps forward, then you'll do 3 steps forward. So for a few years, beaks are getting bigger, and then for the next 10 years, they're getting smaller, and then they're getting kind of medium-sized. So depending on what the environment is like, it's going to favor different things. So it's sort of like if you go for a hike with children. You know, when you go for a walk as an adult, you're trying to get from point A to point B, and you try to get there as quickly as possible for the most part. But if you go for a walk with little kids, you can see that we don't have a straight line arrow from left to right of this screen. We don't get from point A to point B in a direct way. You follow the blue lines. We try to get the kids to go for a walk. They decide to go swimming instead. We have to pull them out of the pond. They jump back in the pond. Then we get them to walk for a little while, and then one of them wanders off the trail and tries to eat a poisonous mushroom. And then you turn around and the other one is back in the pond again, and you try to pull them out. But now they're playing in the sand, and you're trying to point out that you're trying to get to this cool thing at the end of the trail, and they don't care because they're in the sand. So this is more like what evolution works like. We tend to think of things as orderly, and they're trying to get clearly from one point to the next. That's not how it works. You take 3 steps forward, you take 2 steps back, maybe the environment changes again and you go off in a completely different direction, and then the environment changes again and you might reverse all that progress and completely go back to square one. Because evolution is not about getting from point A to point B. Evolution is about adaptations being well suited to the environment or not well suited. And the environment is shifting constantly. So there's no way to say the goal is to become the biggest billed finch, or the goal is to create human beings that are the ultimate creature. If the environment changed profoundly tomorrow, we wouldn't be a well-adapted creature, and we could all go extinct over the course of a few hundred years. So all of this is dictated by the environment. Natural selection is what we've just discussed, and evolution is the broader, just things changing over time. Natural selection explains the part where you have certain features of you, and whether they're good or bad is determined by the environment. And evolution is we end up with all these different species, and how does that happen? So we're not going to go into a ton of detail on evolution at this point. Most of that ends up being covered in BIO2, but I did want to give you guys a bit of perspective on this stuff. You can see on the left side of this slide, there is a link to an interview with a scientist named Neil Shubin from the Colbert Report. And he is quite a famous biologist at this point. And he actually discovered a really incredible fossil called Tiktaalik. And Tiktaalik, for a long time, we had all these fossils of things that lived in the ocean millions of years ago. So we knew life started in the oceans. And then we had all these fossils of things that lived on land, like dinosaurs you've seen in books from elementary school, and early ape creatures that ultimately led to us. So we had these two things. We had ocean creatures, and then we had land creatures. And scientists kept saying all along, all right, life started in the oceans, and then some of those creatures at some point made the move onto land. And then we ended up with land creatures. But nobody could find a fossil of a creature that was kind of in the middle, like something that was sort of fish-like, but sort of land creature-like, that might show us how that would happen, something in between. And Neil Shubin found this fossil Tiktaalik of this creature that really did seem kind of in between. Fish-like, but also kind of amphibian reptile-like. Could haul itself up on the land, but could also swim around in the water. So it was definitely an in-between kind of thing. So what we're trying to do by looking at these fossils is to build what really looks like a family tree. And you may have seen a family tree for humans, just showing, you know, who you descended from and who your ancestors are. And we try to do the same thing with extinct creatures, with fossils. So we're trying to figure out, okay, well, how are we related to fish? Like if we go back in time, where do we find where we link up with fish and we share an ancestor that makes us distant cousins? So we do the same thing with a family tree, what we call a human pedigree. And you guys will be doing these pedigrees when we study genetic disorders and things like that. So to give you a basic orientation about what you're looking at here, we're looking at a family tree. Inside we call it a pedigree. The squares are males and the circles are females. If there's a horizontal line between a square and a circle, it means those two individuals mated and had offspring. All right, so in human family trees, people always refer to it as they're married. Okay, as you may know, you don't have to be married to have a baby. So the line just means they mated and they had offspring. So you'll see a horizontal line between two individuals that mated. You'll see a vertical line coming down from that, and then it will split, show you their offspring. So for Fred and Norma in this pedigree, they mated and they had 2 offspring, a female named Karen and a male named Bob. So you can see the lines come down from Fred and Norma to Karen and Bob. So Karen and Bob are siblings. They're closely related. Now you can see Steve coming in from the left and Anne coming in from the right. So those are the people that Karen and Bob mated with and had their own offspring. So you can see that there are no lines leading up vertically from Anne or Steve. We look at other family trees to see where they came from. So for our purposes, we're focusing on Fred and Norma's offspring. So we've got, oh, hang on, my phone is ringing. Okay. So we've got Karen and Bob, they're the offspring of Fred and Norma, and they each go on to have offspring of their own. So you can see that Karen on the left mates with Steve, and they have 3 female offspring, Tiffany, Melissa, and Amanda. And then over on the right, we've got Bob, and he mates with Anne, and they have 2 offspring, a male named David and a female named Katie. So when we're looking at these family trees, these pedigrees, we look at how related individuals are to each other. So if we look at David and Katie down on the lower right, they're siblings, they're brother and sister. And we know that brothers and sisters are closely related to each other. They share a lot of DNA because they share 2 parents. So their DNA came from the same 2 people. Their DNA is not identical to each other. Brothers and sisters do not have identical DNA. And you know that. You look at them. They're not identical. But they share a lot of DNA. So they share DNA from both Bob and Anne. So when you trace David and Katie back, you don't have to go back very far to find where they join up, where they share what we call a common ancestor. You only have to go back 1 generation. David and Katie share their parents, so they're about as related as you can get. So the brackets that lead up from David and Katie join up very quickly. You only have to go 1 little step up and you find where they link together with their shared parents. Now, if you look at David and Katie, and then you look over on the left at Tiffany, Melissa, and Amanda, those guys are all cousins. So Tiffany, Melissa, and Amanda are sisters, 3 sisters, and they are the cousins of David and Katie. So cousins are related to each other. They share DNA, but in order to find where they link up and share an ancestor, you have to go not just 1 generation back, but 2. You have to go all the way up those steps up to Fred and Norma. So they do share DNA from both Fred and Norma, but some of their DNA is a mix of their other parent that they don't share. So cousins are less related to each other than siblings are. And the way you see that on a pedigree is how far back do you have to go to find that common ancestor, that point where they come together. Turn that pedigree on its side. So we'll see these. And if we do that, it still has the same information. It just isn't oriented the same way. So now that we've got it shifted to the side, we look up top at David and Katie. They're still siblings. They're brother and sister. And when we follow their brackets back, we find that they link together at their shared parents, Bob and Anne. Still, even though we turned it on its side. So that's a very short bracket. It only has to go 1 generation back to show where they share that common ancestor. If we want to compare, say, Katie up at the top and her cousin Tiffany way down at the bottom, we have to trace those steps, those brackets, all the way back to the left to Fred and Norma. That's how far back you have to go before you find where they share that common ancestor. So that's how it would work for a family if you took the family tree and tipped it on its side. And when we look at fossils or we look at living creatures and we try to figure out how they're related to each other, which are closely related and which are so you end up with something that looks very much like that pedigree turned on its side. And here we're looking at a bunch of mammals. So down at the bottom, we've got Canis lupus, so that's the wolf. Canis latrans, that's the coyote. So if we take those as an example, just looking at them, you might guess that they're pretty closely related. But sure enough, if we study DNA, we find that the coyote and the wolf are basically like brothers and sisters to each other. They share a lot of DNA. And you can see that because you look at the line that leads to the left from Canis lupus, the wolf, and the one that leads left from Canis latrans, the coyote, and you only have to go a little ways back before you find their brackets linking up to a common ancestor. So they had some common ancestor that was, kind of wolfish or kind of coyote-like, looked something like them, but not identical. And that was their ancestor. And that ancestor gave rise to both the coyote and the wolf. So at some point, that ancestor's descendants kind of split into these 2 groups. And something about the environment drove the wolf to evolve to look like the wolf, and it drove this other group to look like a coyote and be a coyote. And at some point, they had evolved so differently from each other that they're different species. So if you look at some of these other mammals, if you go up to the top and you look at the panther at the top, Panthera pardus, and you trace its line back to the left, if you want to find how related the panther is to the wolf, they're both meat-eating carnivorous mammals, but even so, if you want to find how closely related they are, you have to go all the way back to the left side of the slide where you see the brackets come together and it says carnivora. So that means the panther and the wolf are distant cousins from each other. They share DNA. They both descended from some ancestor that was some kind of carnivore that gave off all these other descendants. So they're all the descendants of that common ancestor, and they share some DNA, but not a lot. So when we read these pedigrees, the way you need to think about it is that's way over on the right side, the animals that are, or any organism that's stacked on the right side, those are current modern creatures. Those are things that are alive right now. If you want to find out what they evolved from, you have to go over to the left, and that means you're going back in time. So when you go back in time to see what they evolved from, you're looking at things that are extinct. So that ancestor, that carnivore ancestor that gave rise to the panther and the coyote and the wolf and the otter and all these other things in here, that ancestor is gone now. We may be able to dig up fossils of it and see kind of what it looked like. You know, did it look more like a panther? Did it look more like a wolf? But it's gone. So the same thing is true of us. Humans and chimps are cousins, very closely related cousins. We're both apes. We both evolved from some ape-like creature that lived in Africa millions of years ago, and now that creature is gone. So it gave rise to these descendant groups. One of them branched off and became chimps, and the other one branched off and became us. And those differences between us and the chimps is driven by the environment. The environment where chimps live favored a chimp-like creature. The environment where we started to live favored something that began to look more and more like us. So again, it's the environment that dictates what is favored. So we have more evidence of this. We can use DNA now, but even before we could analyze DNA and figure out how close. Here's an example from anatomy. And this is something that even scientists from the 1700s, earlier than that, could study. If you look at the forelimb, so the front limb of lots of different creatures, from cats to bats to birds to whales to humans to horses, if you look at them when they're living, they look quite different. So the front flipper of a whale does not look much like your hand. And the front leg of a horse with the hoof at the end does not look much like the wing of a bird from the external view, just looking at them while they're alive. But if you look at their skeletons, what's really interesting is that the bones are the same in all of those things. So in all of these examples, if you look at the top part of the slide, you'll see the dark brown bone. So in the human, you can see the top dark brown bone in the horse, and then the cat. The bat has a really skinny, long brown bone, and then the bird, and the whale's got kind of a short, stubby one. But they all have it. So that bone is the humerus. So in you, it's basically where your bicep muscle is. It's the bone in your upper arm, and it leads down to your elbow. Turns out horses have a humerus, cats have a humerus, bats have a humerus, birds have a humerus, whales have a humerus. So even though their front leg or front limb has come to look very different from each other, the bones that are in there, the raw material is the same. And you can track that for other bones too. So the bones in your fingers are actually the same as the bones in the lower part of a horse's leg. So the hoof that you see on a horse is its fingernail. It's gotten very thick and powerful. And instead of having 5 different fingers hanging down from its front leg, a horse has only 1 finger. And as it turns out, in case you ever thought favorably about horses, the 1 finger it still has is its middle finger. So horses are running around on their middle fingers all the time. But the bones are the same. The bones in your middle finger are the same as the bones in the horse's lower front leg. So what's happened here is at some point, if you made a family tree of all these creatures, as different as whales, birds, bats, cats, horses, and humans, you could trace them all back if you followed those brackets and looked where they lead. They all go back to a single ancestor that had a front leg that had these bones in it. And then over time, as these creatures spread across the globe and started to live in different environments, and those different environments favored different characteristics, those bones took on different roles, and they looked different in all these creatures. So the key that scientists were looking for is they're like, okay, humans have a humerus, horses, cats, bats, birds, whales, all have a humerus, they all have finger bones, they're all set up basically the same way, they're just variations on a theme. So if we want to lock this whole thing up and figure out the family tree, we got to find some ancestor that had those bones in its front leg that then gave rise to all these other creatures from there. And that's why people were looking for something like, this is kind of what they think it looked like when they put it together. It looks kind of like a frogfish with like flipper legs. And that makes sense. It was kind of in between. It had sort of a flipper leg. Now, if you look at some of these are other fossils, these colored limbs that are down here at the bottom. And the different colors show you which bone is there. So the darkest blue is the humerus. So that in us is our upper arm, where our bicep is. And you can see all these other fossils that they've dug up have those same bones. Now their humerus may be differently shaped. Sometimes it looks just kind of blobby. But the basic recipe for making a front leg has not changed throughout all these fossils and all these millions of years. You have that dark blue humerus at the top, just like our forearm bone. Our upper arm bone. And then you've got two bones, a purple one and a green one, in the middle. That's your radius and ulna, so that's your forearm. Those are the ones that you can feel if you grab, like above your wrist. You can feel those bones moving when you twist your arm. So you have a radius and an ulna, and so, as it turns out, did all these other fossil weird creatures. They had the same bones you do, just looking slightly different. And then you've got kind of a light blue and a light pink, and some of those are the wrist bones. So you have bones as well, and so did all these other crazy fossils. So what we're looking for is some ancestor that had those basic raw material bones, and we're all from there. We've all just been variations on that theme. We've all descended from some ancestor that was like that. And when you look at Tiktaalik, this early creature that seemed to kind of be able to go back and forth between the ocean and the land, it had those bones too. They didn't look like much, kind of a blobby humerus, a blobby radius and ulna, the one in the green, and then a jumble of wrist bones, and then some short little stubby finger-like things. It didn't need a full hand with fingers because it was kind of living still in the mud and the muck, and so a flipper-looking thing was a better adaptation for that environment. But that was the raw material for making all of these things. The horse's leg, the bird's wing, the whale's flipper. They're all just variations on an ancestor that had this very early version, because that's what natural selection can do. It already exists and just decides, is that a winner or a loser? Natural selection can't look at a creature and say, well, I'd like to tinker with this a little bit. I'd like to make this bone longer. It just has to look at what already exists, what hatched, what was born, and say, okay, of this raw material you're giving me, that one is going to win and live to be an adult, and that one is going to die and never have any offspring. So from there, we've just elaborated on this basic model of a forelimb and made all these other things. So that's pretty strong. But then we've got some other interesting things that scientists found a long time ago and just couldn't really explain. So one of these is called vestigial structures. So vestigial means you still have it, but it doesn't seem to serve any purpose. So your appendix, people usually only hear about them when they get infected or inflamed and you have to have them removed. So the appendix is a vestigial structure in us, as far as we can tell. It seems to just be a remainder from some earlier creature we evolved from that needed it for something, but we don't, and we still just have it. Whales have something like that. So whales don't have hind legs. They have a tail that they use to propel them through the water, and they have front legs that they use as flippers to pull themselves through the water. So they don't have any back legs. If you don't have back legs, you don't need a pelvis, because your pelvis is there for your legs to connect to so you can walk. And yet if you look at the skeleton of a whale, it has these few little small bones just kind of floating around within its muscles that are what's left of a pelvis. They don't connect to anything else. There's no legs connected to them, but it's there. Now, if you were to make a whale from scratch, and you were like, I'm going to be as efficient as possible, I'm going to build only the things into this whale that it needs to be a perfect swimming machine, you would not waste your time or energy putting in a pelvis that's there for no reason whatsoever. That pelvis is there because a whale evolved from something that walked on land. So its ancestors needed a pelvis. And over time, we've seen the pelvis get smaller and smaller and smaller through evolution because modern whales that never leave the ocean, never go up on land, don't need a pelvis. But if they evolved from something that did live on land, that did have a pelvis, then you may see that pelvis getting reduced and reduced and reduced over time, but it could very well still be there. And sure enough, that's what we see. So we have to figure out what they evolved from. They're living in the ocean. We know that life started in the ocean. At some point, there was some kind of Tiktaalik-like creature that could go back and forth between the two, made its way onto land. So now we're saying that at some point, there was some land-living creature that then turned around and slowly evolved to go back to living in the ocean techniques where we can look at DNA. And we can figure out which creatures are most closely related to other creatures. We can look at a pedigree, or what we call a phylogenetic tree, that looks like this. Works the same way as the pedigree. So the farther back you have to go to find where two lines connect, where their bracket comes together, the farther back you have to go to find that, the less closely related those creatures are. If the bracket is short, you don't have to go back very far to find their connection, then they're closely related. And all these crazy letters and numbers and arrows, those are different genes, different segments of DNA that they used to figure out this family. So we don't have to worry about those. But if you look down at the bottom, we've got toothed whales and baleen whales. And you can see their bracket is short. You don't have to go back very far to find where they link up, where a common ancestor gave rise to both the whales that have teeth, like sperm whales that munch on squid, and the baleen whales, the ones that just have big filters in their mouths that filter out stuff from the ocean. So it's not surprising that all the whales are close cousins to each other. They all evolved from some whale-like creature in the ocean millions ago. But to try to figure out, okay, well, after that, so they're closely related, what's their next closest cousin? When we analyze the DNA, it actually turns out that the hippopotamus is the most closely related to the whale, versus something like, say, a camel, where you have to go all the way back to the left-hand side of the slide to find where the whales would link up and share a bracket and share a common ancestor with camels. So hippopotamuses, it turns out, are the closest cousins. You will find that they don't really look all that much alike. I think hippos look more like a big, giant, aggressive pig. And yet, it turns out that among the mammals, those are the closest cousins. So the whales are all very closely related to each other, and then their next closest cousin is the hippos. So it makes sense to suspect that if whales evolved from something that lived on land, something that had a pelvis and needed a pelvis, and gradually that creature left the land and evolved into a series of other creatures throughout millions of years, and finally became whales, a hippo is a good candidate because hippos do kind of what whales do. They live mostly in the water, but they can still come up on land. They can walk, they have hind legs, they have a pelvis, but they spend almost the entire day in the water. They can hold their breaths for a long, long time and stay submerged and munch on plants down at the bottom of the river. And so you can kind of see where a hippo can give you a little bit of a glimpse of how this evolution happened. There was some creature, don't really know what it looked like, that started to spend more time in the water and had some series of adaptations that was good for that environment. So its offspring had even more adaptations that were good for being in the water. And eventually you evolved from something that just made brief trips into the water into a creature like a whale that can never leave the water. If it gets stuck on land, it's going to die. So hippos and whales still share a lot of DNA, but if you look at them superficially, they look pretty different. One looks like a walking pig, the other looks kind of more like a fish. A whale doesn't really look like other mammals all that much. It's adapted for swimming, so it has more in common in terms of its body form with a fish than it does with a hippo, because their environments have selected for different features. Hippos still need to go on land, whales don't. So the environment has selected for different body forms, even though the DNA is still fairly similar between them, where we've got two things that look really similar to each other. So here we've got pillbugs. You guys saw very briefly in lab. I wish you had seen them more. Pillbugs are crustaceans, so they're related to lobsters and crabs and things like that. And then down at the bottom of the slide, you can see a pill millipede. So this guy actually looks pretty similar. They both have like these armored plates on their backs. But pill millipedes are a completely different group from pill bugs. They're not closely related at all. They're very distant cousins, and yet they look super similar. So we had whales and hippos that are actually very closely related, but look very different. And then you've got these two things, the pill bug and the pill millipede, that look very similar, but actually are not closely related. So this seems to be a different situation. How does this happen? And this is due to convergent evolution. Just means that if two different creatures living even very, very far apart, even not very closely related to each other at all, if they live in similar environments, and we see over and over again why the environment matters, if they live in similar environments, they may come to very closely resemble each other. So the pill millipede on the left, it lives on moist forest floors, under logs, stones, in the damp dirt. It eats decaying plants. It's kind of a little cleanup crew thing. So that's the pill millipede. The pill bug lives halfway across the globe, but it also lives on moist forest floors, under log stones. It feeds on decaying plant matter. And it turns out that these adaptations that these guys have, an armored back, the ability to roll up in a ball, kind of protective structures on it. These are all things that make sense in an environment that is a moist forest floor under logs and stones eating decaying plant matter. And it doesn't really matter if one is in South America and one is in Africa. If that environment is similar it's going to select for similar traits. So if they're both living in similar places and they are both eating similar things and so much of their lifestyles are similar, they're going to end up looking similar. It's not because they have a lot of DNA in common. It's because they evolved in similar environments. So that's what we call convergent evolution. Two species that are not closely related, but they come to resemble each other closely because their environments are so similar. So that's the entire evolution PowerPoint. You will be responsible for it on the first exam. If you have any questions about it, we can talk about it in class, so make any notes that you need to so that we can do that in person. But otherwise, we will move on to another PowerPoint. We'll finish the chemistry PowerPoint when I see you guys on Wednesday. So enjoy your snow day.